Hi, and welcome to the second part of our lectures on identity. So you should have already listened to the lecture about gender and identity, and today we're going to talk about ethnicity and culture groups and identity. So there can be a lot of things that make up a culture group. It could have various attributes in common: language, religion, food, etc. And you can have various subcultures or subgroups within the overall culture. That will share some parts of the overall culture, but will also have some variations. For example, you guys are members of the IB Academy, and so you share in the overall culture in terms of the classes you take, where you eat lunch, etc., etc. But you may also belong to subgroups within that overall culture, such as band kids, drama kids, etc., etc., being variations on that overall culture. So the things that make up your identity are going to be a lot. So if you look here on our left-hand side, some of the examples: gender, religion, geographic location, family heritage, etc., etc. And the amount that each of those things plays into the creation of your identity is very personal. And so you can think, okay, which of these things do I look at most when I'm thinking about my personal identity? Maybe I think about family heritage most, maybe I think about my occupation most, maybe I think about my language most. It really depends and is very individual per person. So the word race gets thrown around a lot in our society. You'll see it on census forms. You'll hear people talking about different races and things like that. The only issue is that race doesn't really exist as a scientific concept. The idea of it influences us greatly in society, but the actual existence of it really hasn't been scientifically proven. There is biological variation in humankind. Obviously, there are different skin tones, hair tones, eye colors, etc., heights, weights, all of those kinds of things. Definitely, there are biological variations. However, us creating classifications based on those biological variations really isn't justifiable through science. The truth is there's just not that much genetic variety between these different groups that we call races. And there's really no way to tell where one of these categories stops and another category begins, because there's just very little difference within there. So we have created the idea of race, and it was based off of European classifications from the 18th century, where they basically looked at three groups: Caucasians, Mongoloids, and blacks, and they kind of had these very, very broad categories based on visible biological differences, but beyond that, it didn't really have much to do with anything. The idea of racism, then, is this idea that the certain races, these imaginary categories that we've created, are inferior or superior due to biology. And usually you'll see this expressed as someone having a general preference toward one imagined category of people and a general negative attitude toward another imagined category of people. Race in the U.S., we've seen this in a lot of ways. We had some serious segregation based on skin tone, and a great deal of cultural imperialism based on skin tone, where we felt that people of one skin tone were somehow superior to people of another skin tone. Genetic mixing has been so common, not just in the United States, but around the world, that most geographers simply dismiss race at all. It's just not really something that is a useful topic for us to talk about. Now, what is a useful topic for us to talk about is ethnicity. And ethnicity differs from race. Race, when we talk about just race as people imagine it, we are purely talking about biology. And as we said, those differences are so small between the different groups that it's really not worth talking about. Ethnicity gets into some levels of biology, not so much skin tone or appearance, but more inheritance in terms of your heritage and the cultural group that you were born into, and add that to cultural practices that you have taken up in your life, and that is ethnicity. Generally, ethnicities are going to be tied to a particular place in some way. People come from a particular region of the world or region of a country and therefore associate themselves with that particular ethnicity. Ethnocentrism, then, is the idea that a person's particular ethnicity is superior to all other ethnicities, and that therefore should get some sort of preferential treatment. You usually can't choose whether you are part of an ethnicity. You are going to generally be born into it, but you can choose to leave it. You can choose to not practice those cultural mores or the cultural behaviors that make up that ethnicity, and by doing that, choose to leave that ethnicity. But you can't really choose to join an ethnicity. So the history of ethnicities, it's kind of an interesting thing to look at. So generally speaking, they are associated with geographic areas, with religions, with languages, with cultures, et cetera, et cetera. But in some ways, they were also created. Often through the nationalism that rose out of Europe in the 19th century, and also colonialism, we see the creation of ethnicities. So another thing to keep in mind is ethnicities have changed throughout time. If you looked at a map of the British Isles, for example, you would see different ethnicities talking about being Scottish or being Irish or being whatever. But if you go to the United States, all of those groups are kind of lumped into one ethnicity of being white. And yet there's a huge amount of cultural difference between those various groups. Colonial powers basically created ethnicities in the places that they went into in order to divide and conquer. For example, we see that the Germans and Belgians in Africa created height requirements for education, so you had to be a certain height in order to be educated, and thereby they kind of created ethnicities. So the Hutus and Tutsis and the conflict that grew in Rwanda between them actually came out of a created ethnicity by the Belgians. Then those ethnic differences were enforced and reinforced through census taking and identity cards and being told, hey, you are a blank, whatever ethnicity it was. Economic divisions had a huge part to play in this, even when ethnicity is very unclear because the groups are very, very similar due to close living arrangements or the fact that they intermarry and things like that. Groups that share particular economic characteristics will tend to get linked as a group. For example, in the 1930s census of Rwanda, everyone who had 10 head of cattle or more were called Tutsi. And then everyone who had less wealth than that was called a Hutu. And so they basically then economically created these divisions or reinforced the divisions that they had already created with the height requirements they had had earlier. So the Belgians then gave preference to the Tutsis and advantages to the Tutsis, and after independence, those Tutsis then became the scapegoats of all Rwandan problems, and this basically led to the Rwandan genocide later. The creation of ethnicities can also be a political motivator. So people will say, hey, we're going to talk about ourselves as a culture group and that we are distinct and separate from all of these other people around us, and therefore use that as a means to justify getting some sort of political power or political preference in that particular area. So when we start getting into then defining ethnic groups, it actually becomes pretty difficult because ethnic groups often base their identities on very, very different traits. For example, Jewish people, being part of the Jewish ethnic group primarily means religion and practicing Judaism. And in the stricter groups, they're going to say that that practice of Judaism is going to be passed through the female line. But you go to the Amish, And we're looking at the practice of the folk culture as well as the religion. When you start talking about the ethnic groups of African Americans, we then tend to start talking about just skin color. If you're talking about the ethnic group of Swiss Americans, then we're talking about where they came from. If you're talking about the ethnic group of German Americans, we're talking about all these people who speak some sort of ancestral German language. If you're talking about Cuban Americans, then you're mainly talking about them being anti-Castro and anti-Marxist and the people who fled when Castro took over in Cuba and came to the United States. So this creates a lot of problems then when you're saying, okay, an ethnic group is X, because different groups define themselves in very, very different ways. Ethnic comes from the Greek word ethnos for people, so it's kind of who are your people? Who are the people you associate yourself with culturally and with some sort of hereditary aspect thrown in? Okay, so we're looking here at a map of Louisiana, and we see a couple of things here. So if you look at the map on the left, what we're looking at is having a French last name. And so the areas where a French last name would be most common in the telephone directory. So you can see that there are some areas where you are going to have a significant French influence, and then some areas where there is less of a French influence. And you go to the other map, and they're saying, okay, which of these people are listing French as their mother tongue? And you can see a similarity between those two maps. So here we're looking at people who associate themselves with the Creole ethnic group, who are basically French settlers in Louisiana who lived there prior to Louisiana really being settled by Americans. And they may look at it as heritage and where their people came from. They may be basing this on the language that they speak or a variety of things, but they are associating themselves with that particular ethnic group. Here we can see some older ethnic homelands in North America. So you can see everything from Deseret, which is the Mormon homeland in Utah, to Nunavut, which is the Inuit homeland in Canada. And these are territories that are really associated with particular ethnic groups. And then we have some concentrations of various ethnic islands through that middle section, which is going to include a lot of Germans and Scandinavians and various other groups in that particular place. So we see that these are ethnic minorities living in ancient home territories, either that their ancestors lived there in prehistoric times, like this would be the Inuit, for example, or that they moved there and over time and multiple generations passing, they have created an attachment to that particular piece of land. So the Mormons would be an example of that. Okay. With this map, what we're looking at is really ethnic substrates. And so what we're seeing then is areas where, in general, the people have been assimilated into the dominant culture in the region, but there still may be some elements within the culture or within the cultural landscape that speak back to an ethnic island or an ethnic homeland that had existed there previously. So we have a huge German presence in the central part of the United States, and so you can see that with the yellow here, and there may be, as you go through there, you may see foods and particular German foods that are still present in those areas. You may see a lot of German names in the cultural landscape and things of that nature. An ethnic island, then, is going to be a very, very small place that still practices a particular local culture that is associated with a particular ethnic group. So it is much smaller than a homeland. It may be just, a couple thousand people. It is more numerous than the homelands, and you're generally going to see that they survive from one generation to the next because we're seeing land being inherited, and therefore they are passing it on within that cultural group. Okay, so we have a couple things on this slide. The first thing I want to talk about is the maps on the right. And so it's kind of an interesting thing here where we're looking at ethnic settlement patterns and how they've affected the cultural landscape. And so if you take a look at the top map on the right, and that is showing German settlements in a particular county, in the, German houses in a particular county, and then the bottom map shows non-German houses. And if you look at where the placement of these houses are, it becomes kind of interesting. So generally speaking, the German Americans, the people with a Germanic background, are putting less of their houses on the roads than the people with non-German backgrounds. And so we're going to see some difference in the cultural landscape there. Our map here on the left is something that's been created based on kind of the map on the previous page, talking about our ethnic substrates that are still left, and looking at America today being broken into what they call 11 nations, so 11 cultural groups or ways of looking at the world. And so you can see that we are kind of on the edge of the Deep South and the Greater Appalachia region, and therefore we are share some attributes with both. You can look at the far west region versus the left coast. You can look at the Midlands, New France, et cetera, Yankeedom in the northeast. And so that these are different cultural groups and different cultural areas of our country today. Even when we get down to the city level, we're going to see quite a bit of difference in landscape due to ethnicity. One of the things we see here is the difference between an ethnic neighborhood and a ghetto. So an ethnic neighborhood is usually created by choice. Minority people are choosing to live together in order to share resources or to live with people who share their culture, et cetera, et cetera. It is a voluntary community. The benefits to this can be huge. Common use of language, nearby relatives, the types of stores and things that cater specifically to that particular group's needs in terms of food or religion or whatever. And so if we take a look here at Winnipeg and Chicago, you can see that there are a number of these neighborhoods that were created. A ghetto, on the other hand, is a non-voluntary creation, and it is usually used to describe an area where a particular ethnic group has been forced to live. It's an involuntary community. It still functions as a community and a culture region, but it was not created in the same way. This is not created with people choosing to move there. It is usually the city authorities forcing them to do so through discrimination practices or through actual de jure segregation. And today what we've seen is a lot of these areas where people used to be forced to live have now become poorer areas of a city, and so the term ghetto has morphed from being a forced ethnic neighborhood to being a poor area of the city. Okay, so ethnic conflict, and you hear about this a lot in the news between different groups having conflicts with one another, and this is nothing new. The conflict between different cultural groups has been going on pretty much since we had different cultural groups. And basically, it had to do with power and people seeking power over a particular territory or over a particular resource. The thing is, ethnicity was not the reason. People were not having a conflict because they were a different ethnicity. People had a conflict because they wanted something somebody else had. And so ethnicity determined the sides of the conflict, but not the reason for the conflict. Today's ethnic conflict generally has two sources. We're looking at European colonial practices. Remember we were talking earlier about that created ethnicity, like in Rwanda. And it also comes out of those European nationalist movements of the 19th century where the idea was created that every specific cultural group should have self-determination and autonomy over their own territory. And so therefore, if you have a nationless state, remember with our project, if you have a nationless state living in a territory where they do not have autonomy over their particular territory, it was felt that they should have that autonomy, and so that may lead to ethnic conflict as well. Fear of the future lived through the past, so this fear that the world is changing and therefore you cling to the past much more closely, and even clinging to past ideas of injustices and past problems that you may have had. As European colonialism faded, we see often that groups that were given preferential treatment were then seen as the problems within their society, and so often that led to another group attempting to seize power from that preferred group earlier. And so again, we have ethnicity determining the sides of the conflict, but it's not because they are different ethnicities that they cannot live together. Post-Cold War, we have the same kind of thing. Superpowers are doing the same thing that they were during the colonial period, and we are giving aid to particular groups that we like and not giving aid to other groups that we don't like. Down here we have a neat little graph which I found kind of interesting, and is looking at ethnic heterogeneity as you go across the bottom. So what is the percentage of heterogeneity in your culture? How heterogeneous are you, or how homogeneous are you? And then your likelihood of having ethnic conflict. So we look at some place like Bosnia-Herzegovina on the top right, and yes, they have a lot of heterogeneity, and they also have a lot of conflict. Okay, so that would seem to indicate that places with a lot of heterogeneity are going to have a lot of conflict, except when you look at a place like Rwanda. And Rwanda has very little heterogeneity. They're almost all the way to the left. They're a very homogeneous country, and they are almost as high as Bosnia-Herzegovina in terms of their ethnic conflict. And so it's not having a heterogeneous society that makes you have conflict. Instead, it is something else. There's a lot of critique over using the term ethnic conflict, specifically because if the conflict is about power and territory, why do we call it an ethnic conflict? We're implying that different ethnic groups can't get along, when in most countries they do. In most countries, ethnic groups cohabit peacefully. They're not torn apart. And this creation of ethnicities is really kind of a modern thing. So the guy who came up with this, John R. Bowen, says Yugoslavia's conflict and the problems that occurred there had nothing to do with ethnicity, except in determining who was fighting on which side. So we have three main ethnic groups: the Serbs, the Croats, and the Bosnians. And you can take a look here on our map and see how mixed they are in various groups. The Croats were generally Roman Catholic, the Serbs were generally Orthodox Christian, and the Bosnians were generally Muslim. And each population included a sizable number of the other two religions. The religions ended up being kind of symbols of the group differences, but they weren't really problems in and of themselves. In fact, there was a huge likelihood of intermarriage, and intermarriage is one of the most effective ways to blur ethnic lines. And so we have, Serbs marrying Bosnians and Croats and various other things. And so it's not a thing where these were very distinct groups. But what we have is then post-Cold War and post the period where we have a very, very powerful Russian presence and pro-Soviet Union dictator in the country. As they split up and they were looking for autonomy, and various groups wanted to develop autonomy over their own region, they used these ethnic differences as an excuse to go to war and to seek power for themselves. And so two terms I kind of want to end with here for you guys. The first one is ethnic cleansing, and the second one is genocide. So ethnic cleansing has to do with the mass expulsion or killing of one ethnic or religious group in an area by another ethnic or religious group in that area. So it's one difference from genocide is that it may be related to just kicking people out as opposed to killing them automatically, whereas genocide, pretty much you are going to be killing them automatically, and it's the destruction of a nation or an ethnic group. And both of these things happen with the creation of us versus them. And so when you create an us versus them and you say, well, the us, we, are the only ones who have rights in this area, and we are the only ones who have rights to this territory, you end up creating a dehumanizing element for the them, and all of a sudden the them is no longer your neighbor, the them is the enemy. So this is where we kind of get the really vicious and violent parts of our ethnic conflicts today. So that brings our discussion of ethnicity to an end. If you have any questions, you can certainly talk to your teachers about it, and make sure that you finish reading Chapter 5 in your textbook, and we will talk to you tomorrow. Have a good day. Bye-bye.